On the night of February 6, 1996, a Boeing 757 lifted off from Puerto Plata in the Dominican Republic. It was carrying vacationers home to Europe, 176 passengers and 13 crew members bound for Frankfurt with planned stops in Gander, Canada and Berlin. But just minutes later, the aircraft was gone, crashing into the Atlantic Ocean northeast of the airport. No one survived. But what makes Birgenair Flight 301 so haunting is not just the crash itself. It's the chain of confusion that unfolded in the cockpit, a chain that may have started with something as small as an insect nest inside of a measurement instrument. Birgenair Flight 301 was a charter flight operating for Alas Nationalis. The aircraft was a Boeing 757-225. The plan was straightforward: depart Puerto Plata, fly north to Gander for a refueling, stop, continue to Berlin, and then on to Frankfurt. But even before takeoff, the operation had changed. The flight had originally been planned with a Boeing 767, and about 2.5 hours before departure, a mechanical problem came up, and so they had to switch to a different plane. And with that, a different crew was assigned. The new crew reported to the airport at around 2:15 in the morning, UTC. The flight was delayed further because of a late flight attendant. By the time Flight 301 lined up on the runway, it was late, dark, and the crew was dealing with an aircraft change they had not originally been scheduled to fly. At approximately 3:42 a.m., Flight 301 began its takeoff roll. As the aircraft accelerated, the first officer made the standard 80 knots call out. This call is important. It gives the crew a chance to confirm that the aircraft's airspeed indicators and engines are behaving normally before continuing toward takeoff speed. But then the captain noticed a problem. His airspeed indicator wasn't working, but since the first officer's indicator appeared normal, the takeoff continued. According to the investigation, the captain asked the first officer to call out the speeds using his own airspeed indicator. Moments later, the aircraft rotated and became airborne. This was the first critical moment. Indicators later concluded that the aircraft could still have stopped safely on the runway, but the crew continued to take off anyway. To understand what happened next, we need to understand a small device on the outside of the aircraft, the pitot tube. A pitot tube measures air pressure created by the aircraft's forward motion. The pressure helps calculate airspeed. If the tube is blocked, the aircraft's instrument can receive false information. And on a modern jet, false airspeed can confuse not just the pilots, but also the aircraft's automated systems. After takeoff, the captain's airspeed indicators seemed to come alive again, but it wasn't showing the truth. As the Boeing 757 climbed, trapped air pressure in the blocked system produced an airspeed indication that increased with altitude. In other words, the captain's side was showing the aircraft going faster and faster, even though the real speed was much lower. At about 5,300 feet, the captain's instrument showed more than 300 knots. The first officer saw something very different, around 200 knots and decreasing. The crew now had two conflicting stories in front of them. One side said the aircraft was dangerously fast, the other suggested it was slowing down. The autopilot and auto throttle had been engaged. The aircraft was climbing, the pitch altitude was high, and the crew was trying to understand warnings that did not seem to make sense. Then came an overspeed warning. To the pilots, this was deeply confusing. The captain's side was showing a very high speed, but the aircraft's actual energy state was moving in the opposite direction. The aircraft wasn't flying at safe speeds, it was actually getting closer to a stall. Seconds later, the stick shaker activated. In an aircraft, the stick shaker is a stall warning. It shakes the control column to alert the pilots that the wing is approaching a loss of lift. The crucial detail is that the stick shaker is not the same as an airspeed warning. It is based on angle of attack, the angle between the wing and the airflow. So basically, the aircraft's safety systems were saying, hey, you're about to stall here. But the crew was hearing two different things at once: overspeed and stall. One warning suggested they were too fast. The other meant that they were too slow or at too high of an angle of attack. In that moment, the cockpit became overwhelmed by contradictory information. At 3:45 a.m., the stick shaker began. The auto throttle in VNAV mode disconnected, but the center autopilot initially remained connected. The engines were briefly reduced, then power was restored. The aircraft pitched to about 21 degrees before the autopilot disconnected. Now the crew had to manually recover an aircraft that was slow, unstable, and giving them unreliable speed information. Investigators later found that during the final phase of the flight, the crew didn't carry out the proper stall recovery. The aircraft remained nose up for nearly a minute after the autopilot disconnected, rolling from side to side as it descended. The ground speed dropped, then the aircraft's pitch changed sharply downward. The ground proximity warning sounded as the aircraft descended toward the Atlantic. At approximately 3:47 a.m., only about 5 minutes after takeoff, Birgenair Flight 301 struck the ocean about 14 nautical miles northeast of Puerto Plata, and sadly, all 189 people on board were killed. After the crash, investigators focused on the captain's pitot system. The wreckage wasn't fully recovered, so the exact obstruction was never physically confirmed, but the flight data and cockpit voice recorder evidence were consistent with a blocked captain's pitot tube. The plane had reportedly not flown for about 20 days before the accident. During that time, an engine inspection and ground run were performed, and investigators believed that pitot covers had not been installed during at least part of that period. The suspected culprit was mud or debris from a small insect commonly described in aviation safety summaries as a mud dauber wasp. Mud daubers are known for building nests in small openings, and an uncovered pitot tube is exactly the kind of place where that can become dangerous. That tiny blockage did not, by itself, make the crash inevitable, but it was the first domino. The final report didn't list the blocked pitot tube as the sole probable cause. Instead, investigators concluded that the probable cause was the crew's failure to recognize the stick shaker as an imminent stall warning and their failure to apply the correct recovery procedures. The report also stated that the crew became confused by the false increasing airspeed indication and the overspeed warning before the stick shaker activated. The report cited several contributing factors: flight crew training, cockpit actions, use of procedures, knowledge of aircraft systems, and maintenance practices, including not installing pitot covers while the aircraft was on the ground and not performing pitot-static checks before returning the aircraft to service after a long time parked. In other words, Birgenair 301 was not just a story about a blocked sensor, it was a story about how one faulty instrument, combined with automation, inadequate troubleshooting, missing or insufficient procedures, and cockpit confusion, can turn a manageable problem into a catastrophe. After the incident, investigators recommended changes to Boeing 757 and 767 manuals, and better training for blocked pitot tube scenarios, procedures for unreliable airspeed, and stronger crew resource management training. The FAA safety review noted that Boeing later added information on suspected unreliable airspeed to flight crew manuals. They added an airspeed unreliable checklist and introduced alerts such as IAS disagree and alt disagree on the EICAS system. Today, the lessons from Birgenair Flight 301 remain painfully clear. Cover the pitot tubes, verify the instruments, respect the stick shaker, and when the instruments disagree, fly the airplane first. Because on Flight 301, the aircraft was still flyable, the weather was fine, and the engines were operational. Investigators found no evidence of fire, explosion, or hostile activity before impact. The real danger was confusion. Confusion created by a tiny blockage, amplified by automation, and left unresolved in the most critical minutes of the flight. Birgenair Flight 301 is remembered not only for the 189 lives lost, but for the safety lessons that followed. Aviation became safer because investigators studied what happened, pilots trained for unreliable airspeed, and manufacturers improved procedures and warnings. But for the families of those on board, those lessons came at an unbearable cost. Yeah, plane in the sky and it lost control. Flying low, not knowing fast or slow. Blocked hole caused by a wasp nest. Lost souls and the death toll are repeated those. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy these kinds of stories and found this useful, please leave a like and subscribe, and we do have a lot more coming. Thanks.